Welcome back to Q&A and good morning to Dr. Anne-Marie Brady from Canterbury University, an expert in Chinese domestic and foreign politics. Tēnā koe, good morning. You have returned relatively recently from a trip to Washington DC, and this plays into the report we want to discuss this morning. First of all, that trip itself, not the report we are going to discuss, was sponsored by the Taiwan Foundation for Democracy, is that right?
Oh, it was an academic conference that a whole bunch of other academics were invited to, so it's quite common. They invited us to a conference and said they'd pay for any airfare.
Who is the Taiwan Foundation
Taiwan
for Democracy?
Democracy Foundation is an NGO based in Taiwan.
Okay, promoting Taiwanese interests, presumably.
Presumably.
Okay. For those viewers who are interested in your report, we're going to make sure we put a full copy of it and a link to the full copy up on our Facebook page this morning. But you begin with what is a Leninist idea of a united front approach to geopolitical influence. And political influence is, of course, a hot topic at the moment internationally, although we generally focus on Russian and US influence. What does a united front approach mean to political influence in New Zealand?
It's about influencing policies in a particular country, influencing political elites, and it's also about accessing strategic information, and it also may be about accessing strategic resources.
So, from China's approach, what does this mean on the ground here?
Well, China's United Front strategy is always a multi-level approach, so it's not just one sort of angle. So the paper, it's 57 pages long, so there's a lot of detail in there. But I'd highlight certain points. For example, our Chinese language media has now been co-opted. It's gone from being an independent media, very much an indigenous New Zealand Chinese language media, to now having cooperation agreements on content with Xinhua, and even getting direct oral instructions from CCP propaganda department officials. In June, I was very surprised to see a meeting at the Langham Hotel of all the leading Chinese language media outlets in New Zealand, with the exception of Falun Gong, of course, because the Chinese government treats them as beyond the pale. And they were getting oral instructions, as I said, from China's agency which manages the domestic media in China. So that's one example. Political donations, very, very, very close contacts between our political parties. After the 19th Party Congress, an indication of the impact of this is that the president of the National Party and the Labour Party and university figures have all been making pro-Xi statements, pro-19th Party Congress statements. Well, that's incredible. It's like invasion of the body snatchers. Nobody would be saying this about Trump or about the Republican Party, but it's become de rigueur for our political elite to make these pro-Xi, pro-Chinese Communist Party statements.
Because when we talk about soft power and we consider some of those approaches, whether it is low-level political donations, Chinese expat community, Chinese media in New Zealand, from the outside, it doesn't feel as though those would be particularly influential. But what you're saying is they actually have significant influence.
Well, there is, if you want to look at some indicators, for example, as I said, those pro-Xi statements, pro-19th Party Congress statements that have come out, which are extraordinary for our political elites.
Why does a pro-Xi statement matter?
We don't make that about the US government. Our university officials wouldn't be making those statements about the US government. Another indicator of impact is the no surprises policy, which of the national government, which was their line on China, which effectively silenced debate on China in our policy establishment and more broadly in the community. I mean, we want to be able to have contestable policy advice. We need deep policy advice. There's a change in global order. There's a lot to think about for a small state. And so this had a really negative impact on silencing. What we needed was, a consideration of all ranges of our relationship, all aspects of our relationship with China.
I want to speak about the two MPs identified in your paper in a moment, but let's consider this in a broader context. Why does China care about New Zealand?
Global geopolitics is shifting, and I wrote about called China as a Polar Great Power, and I recommend you to look at the front cover of that. There's a map on there, which is the new official map of China. It's a vertical map, and in that map, which has China at the centre of the map, you see the world island becomes very apparent for people who know their geopolitics. You see how the oceans are connecting us. You see the centrality and importance of Antarctica, which appears like a white peacock, and the Arctic Ocean becomes like a central ocean. So geopolitics are moving in different directions from where they have been for the last couple of 100 years, and New Zealand is part of where China is now interested, moving south, for example.
So particularly Antarctica?
Yes, South Pacific, Antarctica. China, to give you an example of this geostrategic interests, China's rolling out its own equivalent of GPS. It's called Beidou 2. And GPS is not just for driving your car and making sure you don't get lost, it's for missile positioning and timing. And so China has Beidou 2 satellite receiving stations in Antarctica, because it has, by the definition of a country that's a non-claimant state, they can say it has undetermined sovereignty. Now, New Zealand's a claimant state, that's not what we call Antarctica. But the Antarctic Treaty permits other countries to look at Antarctica in a different way and not acknowledge the sovereignty of claims of country like New Zealand or Australia, which means that countries like China and Russia are looking to Antarctica very differently than they did in the past. It's not just about resources, it's about having these strategic satellite receiving stations which will enhance GLONASS, which is the Russian equivalent of GPS, and Beidou 2. So New Zealand, as an Antarctic claimant state, is useful and interesting to New Zealand if we were opposed to China's activities in Antarctica. For China, we have a big maritime space. We are responsible for the foreign policy and defence of policies of 3 Pacific states. We are also very influential in the Pacific. We've also been very amenable and very cooperative to China, and a Chinese diplomat even praised New Zealand recently as having as good a relationship with China as China once had with Albania in the 1960s. And if that's the case, we're probably really in trouble, because Albania was the most isolated of all the East European countries in the Eastern Bloc, and we do not want to be the most isolated of all the countries in the Western Bloc.
I want to focus more on what a united front approach to this soft power influence means in New Zealand. What sort of influence has China won through political donations in New Zealand?
Well, the Fairfax did an interesting study on the issue of political donations in New Zealand. They said that about 83% of national, about 81% of Labour's donations are anonymous. We do have a system since 2008 that large donations are recorded, but when donations are coming through charities and auctions, for example, they don't have to be recorded.
So
where
you
they're
think we
coming
need to
from.
reform the Electoral Finance Act again?
We need to have a look at it. You know, there's other countries who have parallels with us, like Norway, who don't follow the method of campaign donations. It's state funded according to your votes, and that's one way to protect a nation against political interference. New Zealand needs to become more resilient. What China is doing, other countries are also interested in doing. We just have to prepare for the new realities of the changing global order. We need to be sensible. And so to be more resilient, we need to look at our legislation, see where there's the gaps. We also need to do an investigation into what's been going on. Australia is already ahead of us, 2 years ahead of us on this, Canada too. And we should follow them in doing an in-depth investigation, and we should also partner with them to see how we can learn from them and protect ourselves better against what's happening.
How broad should that investigation be? It has been widely reported the National MP Jian Yang had 15 years at a military training institution in China. Bill English came out before the election and said he wasn't overtly concerned about it. He felt as though he hadn't been misled. How should the government have responded to that?
Well, you know, National was, in the midst of an election campaign, and they no doubt wanted to minimise the damage to them. What's going on behind the scenes is probably a bit different. But this is not the time to headbutt China on what's been happening. This is a time for us as a country to pull together, as a people to pull together. We don't want McCarthyism, we don't want shaming. A lot of people got caught up with this and did not know what they were getting into. We need better due diligence on who our partners are. We need political parties perhaps to be vetting their MPs better.
So I was interested in Labor's response to it, because Labor did not come out strongly in any sense. What did you make of Labor's response?
I think they were afraid. I think they got a bit burnt with the Chinese surnames thing. And I think they really lack China knowledge in their top team. That's a real problem for us as a country. If you think about it, I can't think of a single MP in this parliament who has Chinese language skills other than the two ethnic Chinese MPs. And if China is the most important relationship to New Zealand, as John Key told our diplomats in 2008, then we need to work a lot harder as a country to develop the China language skills and the China knowledge. But it has to be us setting the agenda, learning from a New Zealand perspective, not having it imposed on us in China's frames imposed
So what
on
is
us.
your message to the new government?
Now's the time to have a look at our legislation, develop that internal resilience and be prepared, be proactive for the changing global order.
Okay, Anne-Marie, I just really quickly want to go through some responses from both Zhang Yang and Raymond Huo, who were identified in your paper. Very quickly, both MPs did not want to add to any comments they'd made publicly when we approached them this week. Zhang Yang denies he was ever a spy. He acknowledges teaching students English at a military institution in China to allow them to monitor communications and collect information. And Raymond Huo denies any insinuations against his character. As I say, your full report, we'll have a link to that on our Facebook page this morning. Professor Anne-Marie Brady, thank you for your time.
My pleasure.